The morning bit like winter steel. Frost clung to the grass, and every breath Silas Thornton drew burned in his lungs. He rose before dawn, same as always, stoking the fire with practiced hands before stepping into the cold, with his rifle slung across one shoulder. The sky was the color of bruised slate, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains loomed sharp and distant against the rising light. At 45, Silas was a man carved by years of work and war. His body was lean, hardened by ranching and long rides through hostile country. His face, worn and quiet, carried the kind of lines that didn't just come from the sun. His beard was trimmed short, streaked with gray, and his eyes, storm gray, steady, held that watchful stillness of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. He wasn't out there for sport. In the high country near the New Mexico border, winter made hunters out of everyone who wanted to stay alive. Deer, rabbit, even wild turkey. It didn't matter what he brought home, as long as there was meat on the table. A man living this far from town couldn't depend on a store that might close for weeks when snow cut off the trail. Silas moved quietly through the pines, his boots crunching over frozen needles. The rifle in his hands wasn't for show. It was an old Spencer, oiled and dependable, same one he'd carried through the war. Every few steps he stopped, listened, and breathed slow, his mind tracking the faint prints of a buck he'd spotted 2 days earlier. But hunting wasn't all that occupied his thoughts. The truth was, hunting was just an excuse. A reason to be out here where the world didn't ask him to remember who he used to be. Once long ago, he'd been Captain Silas Thornton, Union Army scout, decorated and respected. He had a wife back in Missouri, Elizabeth, gentle as spring rain, strong as the oak that shaded their farmhouse. She'd waded through the war, prayed through it, and died of fever a year after peace came. He buried her beneath that oak and walked away from everything they'd built. He never went back. After that came his last mission, one that should have been routine but turned into the kind of nightmare that reshapes a man's soul. The Raven Ridge Massacre. It had started with orders. A suspected Apache raiding party. Intelligence said they'd stolen horses and attacked a wagon train. The colonel in charge, Montgomery Reed, wanted to end it clean. But when Silas scouted ahead, what he found wasn't a war camp. It was a peaceful village. Women grinding corn, children playing in the dust, elders tending fires. He tried to stop it. Reed wouldn't listen. By the next sunrise, the village was ashes. The army called it a victory. Silas called it damnation. He turned in his commission the next day and rode west until the world forgot his name. Now, 10 years later, he lived alone in a small cabin tucked against the timberline. Just him, his rifle, and the ghost that never stopped whispering. That morning, the forest was still. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. The tracks he followed curved along a ridge, leading to a patch of snow unbroken except for one strange mark. A perfect circle drawn into the white, 12 feet across, symbols etched around its edge. Silas crouched, running a gloved hand over the markings. He knew enough of Apache sign to recognize them. Symbols for protection, for passage, for the spirit world. The kind used in burial or cleansing rites. But something was wrong. A dark stain marred the snow near the edge of the circle. Blood, fresh not more than a few hours old. His instincts flared. Rifle up, he scanned the tree line. The silence heavy as judgment. No movement. No sound but the groan of a tree shifting in the cold. He stepped closer. At the center of the circle lay what first looked like a bundle of cloth, half buried in snow. Then it moved. Silas froze. It wasn't cloth, it was a woman. Her skin was the color of burnished copper, her hair long and black, fanned across the white like spilled ink. She wore a torn buckskin dress, dark with dried blood. Her wrists were raw, the skin cut from where ropes had bitten deep. Her breathing came shallow, barely there. Jesus, Silas muttered under his breath. He knelt, setting the rifle aside long enough to check for a pulse. Cold skin, but there it was, faint, stubborn, still beating. As his fingers brushed her neck, her eyes snapped open. They were dark, fierce, alive with the defiance of someone who had seen death and refused to yield to it. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, just stared straight at him as if daring him to finish what someone else had started. Her lips parted, cracked and bleeding. "The black crows are coming," she whispered. The words struck him like a hammer. Black crows. That's what the Apache called certain cavalry units. The ones who wore black hats. Reed's men. His old regiment. But that couldn't be right. They weren't supposed to be anywhere near here anymore. Before he could ask another word, her eyes rolled back. She went limp in his arms. Silas looked down at her, at the blood staining her dress, at the circle around them, the symbols of the dead. He should have walked away. He knew it. Bringing an Apache woman into his cabin was asking for trouble. The nearest town barely tolerated him as it was, and the Santa Fe papers were full of headlines screaming about Indian attacks again. Still, he couldn't do it. Not again. Not after Raven Ridge. He sheathed his guilt behind a single thought. No one deserves to die alone in the snow. Silas slid his arms beneath her body and lifted. She was light, too light, like a bird whose wings had frozen mid-flight. The warmth of her blood seeped into his coat as he started back toward the trail. His breath fogged the air, the crunch of his boots the only sound in a world gone silent. The forest closed in, shadows lengthening as the morning light thinned through the trees. Somewhere distant, a raven cried, a harsh, echoing sound that made him tighten his grip. By the time he reached the clearing where his cabin sat, the sun was high, cold, and bright. Smoke curled from the chimney. The fire he'd banked before leaving still smoldered. He kicked the door open with his boot and stepped inside. The cabin was small, one room, solidly built from logs and years of solitude. A narrow bed stood against the far wall, a quilt folded neatly at its foot. Shelves lined with jars of beans, dried corn, and a sack of flour framed the hearth. A Winchester rifle leaned against the wall beside the door. Silas laid the woman gently on the bed. Her eyes flickered open again, confusion and suspicion warring across her face. He saw the fear there, the instinct to fight, to survive, but also the exhaustion that left her powerless to move. "Easy," he said, voice low. "You're safe." He pulled the quilt over her shoulders and moved to the hearth, tossing a fresh log onto the fire. The flames caught, filling the cabin with a soft orange glow. Steam rose as he poured hot water from the kettle into a tin cup and carried it back to her. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, fingers brushing his for the briefest second. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, then slumped back, breathing hard but steady. Silas sat beside the bed, elbows on his knees. "You got a name?" he asked quietly. For a long moment she said nothing. Then in halting English she whispered, "Ayita." He nodded once. "Silas?" That was all. No more words needed. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the eaves. Inside, the fire cracked and popped. Two strangers sat within the circle of its light, one haunted by what he'd done, the other by what had been done to her. When she finally slept, Silas leaned back in his chair and watched the snow start to fall again outside the window. Each flake melted against the glass, leaving a trace that faded almost instantly. He thought about the blood on the snow, the circle of symbols and her warning, the black crows. If Reed's men were truly in this territory again, the past he'd buried was about to claw its way back from the grave. He stared into the fire until his eyes burned, the old guilt twisting inside him like a knife. 10 years of silence had not been enough to atone for one morning of horror. But as the storm deepened and the Apache woman breathed softly in his bed, Silas knew one thing for certain. This time, if the crows came for her, they'd have to go through him first. The storm rolled in hard through the night, hissing against the cabin walls like 1,000 whispered memories. By dawn, snow lay deep and clean across the clearing, muffling every sound except the pop and sigh of the fire. Silas Thornton woke the same way he always did, slowly, carefully, with the instinct of a man who'd learned to wake ready. But this morning was different. There was someone else breathing in the room. "Aita." He sat up from his bedroll near the hearth, the quilt still drawn high around her on the narrow bed. She was awake now, her dark eyes open, following him quietly as he stirred the fire back to life. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the crackle of burning pine filled the silence. "You made it through the night," Silas said finally, his voice rough from disuse. Ida didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted toward the window where the light broke weakly through frost. When she did speak, her English came halting, every word careful, as if weighed before release. "I thought I would die there." He poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. "You almost did." Her fingers brushed his when she took it. They were cold, calloused, a survivor's hands. She sipped once, then twice, and coughed quietly, the warmth cutting through her throat. "You live alone?" she asked after a moment. Silas nodded. "Ain't much company up this way except ghosts and coyotes. Guess now I've got both." The corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. Then she set the cup aside and looked at her bandaged wrists. "You helped me." "Why?" He shrugged, stoking the fire. "Didn't seem right to leave you out there." "Not right," she repeated softly, as if testing the phrase. Then her gaze hardened. "White men do not help my people. Not after Raven Ridge." The name hit him like a slap. He kept his eyes on the flames. "You know about that?" "I was there," she said simply. "A child hiding under burned wood. I remember faces, fire, screams." Silas's hand tightened on the iron poker until the metal creaked. "That was a long time ago." "Not for me." The words hung heavy in the air, too heavy for either of them to move beneath. Silas stood abruptly and crossed to the small table near the window. He needed distance, even if the cabin barely offered any. He tore a slice of bread from a loaf, set it on a plate beside a few beans from the pot still warming on the coals, and carried it over. "Eat," he said gruffly. She hesitated, studying him, then nodded. Hunger won over mistrust. She ate slowly, cautiously, as though unsure the food would stay in her stomach. Watching her, Silas realized how thin she was, how she'd probably gone days without real food. When she finished, she looked at him again. "You were a soldier," she said, not as a question. He met her gaze, tired but honest. "Once, not anymore." She studied his eyes for a long time. "Still have soldier eyes." He didn't answer that. The truth was, some things never left you. Not the eyes, not the smell of gunpowder or blood in snow. Ida shifted beneath the blanket, her voice lower now. "The men who took me, they wear black hats, like crows." Silas looked up sharply. "You said that yesterday. Black crows. You mean cavalry?" She nodded. "But not army now. Work for railroad. Same leader. Blue eyes. Scar here." She traced a finger down her cheekbone. "He called himself Colonel Reed." For a heartbeat, the world stopped moving. Silas's stomach turned cold. Reed. The same Reed who'd given the order at Raven Ridge. The same man Silas had once followed into hell. "You're sure?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I do not forget eyes like his," she said, her tone flat. "He wants what my people guard. Land. Sacred ground. He think gold sleeps under it." Silas turned away, pacing toward the table. On it lay an unopened envelope, the one he'd found slipped under his door before that last hunt. He pulled it out and handed it to her. "Read Yashaver did?" she asked. He nodded. "You'll understand." Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was neat, almost too careful, the words formal and cold. It was from the Santa Fe Town Council, urging Silas to sell his land to the Western Union Railroad Company, the same company Reed now worked for. They called it progress, offering money beyond fair compensation. But beneath the civility, the message was clear. "Sell willingly, or we'll take it another way." Aida's eyes moved over the page. "This land," she murmured. "These hills, they are part of the circle." "What circle?" Silas asked. She pointed toward the mountains beyond the window. "Where ancestors sleep, where I was making ceremony when they found me. Before, they stopped it." "Stopped it?" he repeated. Ida nodded. "Circle to send spirits home. When white men take land, we must send them first, or they lose their way. My father was keeper of that ceremony. Before he died, he teach me." Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied it. "Reed think I know where gold is. He kill my people to find it. I tell him, no gold, only graves. But he not believe." Silas let out a slow breath. The pieces were clicking together. The railroad, the letter, Reed's men wearing black hats. It wasn't just business. It was conquest dressed in paperwork. "You said he took you," Silas said carefully. "How'd you get away?" Ida's eyes darkened. "I did not run. They leave me. Tied. Think I die." She looked toward the fire, her expression unreadable. "Maybe they wanted spirits to finish me." He studied her, seeing not the fragile woman he'd carried from the snow, but someone forged in pain and survival. "You're lucky I came along." "No," she said quietly, "not lucky. Spirit sent you." Silas gave a short, humorless laugh. "If that's true, the spirits have got a strange sense of timing." Ida tilted her head, studying him. You do not believe in signs? He hesitated. Once did, not anymore. Then why save me? He looked at her then, really looked, and saw the same defiance that had burned in her eyes when she lay dying in the snow. It stirred something in him, something buried deep under guilt and time. Because I couldn't stand to see it happen again, he said simply. Ida's expression softened, just a fraction. You saw too much death. So did you. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence born from understanding, the quiet acknowledgement of two souls who'd both lost everything. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen hills. Silas went to the hearth, stirred the pot again, then glanced back at her. You'll need rest, he said. You're safe here for now. For now, she echoed, her tone dry. But he will come. Silas didn't argue. He knew she was right. By midday, the snow eased, and sunlight streamed through the window in thin golden stripes. Ida had fallen asleep again, her breathing steady this time. Silas sat at the table, the letter still spread before him. He traced the map drawn on its back, the boundary lines of his property, the shaded area marked proposed route. The route didn't just cross his land. It cut straight through the valley where Ita had spoken of the sacred circle. He exhaled slowly, the weight of understanding settling like a stone. If Reed got what he wanted, it wouldn't just be his cabin gone. It would be the burial ground of an entire people. He looked toward the bed. Ita shifted in her sleep, murmuring something in her language. He caught only one word, spirits. Something inside him twisted. Maybe he'd been wrong all these years, thinking he could bury the past by hiding from it. Maybe the past was meant to find him, to give him one last chance to do something right. He rose, took his coat from the peg by the door, and stepped outside. The air was bright and sharp, the snow dazzling under a cloudless sky. In the distance, a lone raven wheeled above the trees, black against white. Reed, he muttered under his breath, you're not taking this land. When he returned inside, Ida was awake again, sitting up against the headboard. You go, she asked. Just check the trail, he lied. Snow covered everything, no tracks. She nodded, then looked at him with quiet certainty. You think to fight him? Silas paused. You think I shouldn't? Fighting Reed will not stop him, she said. He is like fire. Burns everything. You cannot fight fire with gun. No, he admitted, but you can stop it from spreading. Ida considered that, her gaze steady. Then you will help me finish the ceremony. It wasn't a question. Silas stared at her across the room, the firelight flickering between them. 10 years ago, he'd walked away from the world believing redemption didn't exist. Now sitting across from this wounded woman, with the scar of his own sins written in her eyes, he wasn't so sure. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. When the snow clears, he said, we go back. Ida's lips parted, a faint tremor in her breath. Then spirits will rest. Maybe we both will, he said quietly. Outside, the raven called again, a sharp, echoing cry that rolled across the frozen valley like a warning. The snow began to melt 3 days later, slow and reluctant, like the land itself didn't want to let go of winter. Thin rivulets of water trickled off the eaves of the cabin, and the air carried that damp, metallic scent that came right before spring. Silas Thornton stood outside splitting firewood, sleeves rolled to his elbows, breath steaming in the morning chill. Every strike of the axe echoed through the trees, sharp and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Behind him, Ida's voice drifted through the open cabin door, soft, melodic, almost prayer-like. She was humming again, the same haunting tune she'd sung in her sleep. Song of the Eagle. It wrapped around the forest like smoke, ancient and heavy with memory. Silas paused mid-swing and listened. There was no understanding the words, but he could feel what they carried. Loss, promise, sorrow, and something that might have been hope. When the last log split, he set the axe aside, wiped his hands on his coat, and stepped back inside. Aida sat near the hearth, her wounds mostly healed. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes, though still shadowed, held a quiet steadiness. She'd been working while he chopped wood, weaving something with strips of raw hide and beads the color of earth and bone. What's that? He asked, nodding toward her hands. She looked up. Medicine cord, she said, for journey, for protection. He gave a short laugh. Reckon I could use all the protection I can get. You could, she agreed without a smile, then added, but spirit must protect itself, not just skin. Silas leaned against the doorframe, folding his arms. You really think this ceremony's going to change anything? Reed's got men, rifles, money. We've got, what, a song and a prayer? Ida tied the last knot, her fingers steady. You do not understand. Ceremony not for him. It is for balance, for peace. When we finish it, his power will fade. He frowned. You think a song can stop a man like Reed? She met his gaze. No, but it can stop you from becoming him. The words landed like a stone in his chest. He looked away, jaw tight. You don't know what I've become? Ada stood slowly, stepping closer. I know what war does. To you, to me. But you still listen. That means spirit not lost. Silas exhaled, long and slow. You talk like you already forgave me. I do not forgive, she said quietly. I understand. Different thing. The silence stretched, heavy and alive. Outside, a raven called, its cry cutting through the stillness like a warning. By noon, the two of them were packing for the journey back toward the sacred valley. Silas saddled his mare, a bay with a white blaze named Mercy, the last thing he'd ever named after his wife died. Ida watched from the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, her hair braided down her back. You sure you're strong enough for this? He asked. I am strong, she said simply. Then she pointed to the horizon. We must go before snow returns. He helped her mount behind him, and they set off through the thinning woods, the mare's hooves crunching over patches of ice and mud. The air smelled of pine and thawing earth. They rode in silence for miles, the landscape unfolding like a memory. Ridges and dry riverbeds, the skeletons of old trees clawing at the sky. The closer they got to the valley, the heavier the air seemed to grow. Finally, Aida spoke. You were there that day, she said softly, not accusing, just stating it like the wind might state direction. Silas's grip tightened on the reins. Yeah, you shot my father. The words burned hotter than gunfire. He didn't answer, not right away. What could he say? Denial would be a lie. Excuse would be an insult. He could still see it, the smoke, the chaos, the colonel's voice barking orders. A man with a rifle stepping in front of a child. A split second of hesitation. A trigger pulled in confusion. He swallowed hard. I didn't know. Everything happened so fast. Ada's voice cut through, calm but sharp. He was singing the death song. For the children. You killed him before he finished. Silas felt something break inside him. Something old and rotten that had festered too long. I tried to stop it, he said hoarsely. Reed gave the order. I tried. I know, she said, surprising him. I saw. He turned his head slightly. You saw? Ida nodded. You stopped another man. Pushed him away from my mother. You looked at me. Your eyes. She hesitated. You look sorry. I remember that more than the gun. Silas's breath caught. 10 years of nightmares, and she remembered that. I buried him, she went on quietly. My father. After the soldiers left. I was only 12. I sang alone. He closed his eyes for a long moment, fighting the sting behind them. You shouldn't have had to. No child should, she said. They rode on in silence after that. But something had shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but an understanding deep enough to share the same air without hate. By late afternoon, they reached the valley. It lay quiet beneath the mountains, blanketed in pale mist. Broken stones marked where the old village had once stood. Charred remains of huts poked from the snow like bones of the earth itself. Ida slid off the horse, her feet sinking into the soft ground. She walked a few steps ahead, then stopped, eyes closed. They are still here, she murmured. Silas followed, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't need her words to feel it. The place carried a weight, not of danger, but of sorrow that had soaked deep into the soil. Ida knelt near what used to be the fire pit, brushing snow away until symbols appeared. Faded circles and lines carved into stone. She began arranging her medicine cord, beads catching the weak sunlight. Silas set his rifle down, scanning the ridge. No movement, but instincts told him they weren't alone for long. You sure this is safe? He asked. She didn't look up. Safe is not same as right. He couldn't argue with that. Ada lit a small fire, feeding it with sage and cedar from her pouch. The smoke rose in thin silver ribbons. She began to chant, low, rhythmic, ancient. The sound vibrated through the air, deep in the chest, as if the mountain itself was listening. Silas watched, uneasy but entranced. The chant grew stronger, the air thick with scent and sound. He didn't understand the language, but he understood the meaning. Every syllable was a wound being reopened, every breath a plea for peace. And then he saw it. Faint at first, like a mirage. Shapes in the smoke. Figures. Women holding children. Men standing with spears. The dead, or the memory of them. Ida's eyes were wet but steady. She spread her hands wide, palms toward the sky. "They go now," she whispered. Silas stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Aida!" Before he could finish, a sound split the air. A metallic click. A rifle hammer cocked. He spun around, hand reaching for his gun. On the ridge above them stood 3 riders. Dark shapes against the pale sky. Black hats. Reed's men. "Damn it," Silas growled. Ida didn't stop singing. Her voice rose, defiant, even as the horses descended the slope. "Get behind me," Silas said, pulling his rifle up to his shoulder. "No," she said firmly. "If I stop, they win." He didn't argue again. He fired once, the shot echoing off the canyon walls. One rider toppled. The other 2 scattered for cover. Ida's song grew louder, piercing the chaos. The smoke from the fire twisted higher, curling like an eagle's wing. Silas reloaded fast, eyes scanning for Reed. He knew the man would come. He could feel it in his bones. The ceremony wasn't finished, but something in the air had shifted. The ground beneath them trembled faintly, as if the earth itself remembered what had been done here. "Finish it," Silas shouted over the gunfire. Ida's voice broke once, then steadied again. "Almost." Another shot whistled past, grazing the bark near Silas's head. He ducked, rolled behind a boulder, and fired back. When he looked up again, Ida stood in the center of the circle, arms outstretched, eyes closed, bathed in smoke and sunlight. The song reached its peak, high, pure, unbroken. And for a heartbeat, everything went still. The wind stopped. The ravens fell silent. Even the gunfire died into nothing. Silas felt it, like a pressure lifting, a shadow receding. Then Ida sank to her knees, exhausted but alive. "It is done," she whispered. Silas rushed to her, dropping his rifle. "You all right?" She nodded weakly. "Spirits. Free." He looked up at the ridge. The 2 riders were gone. The valley was silent again, only the smoke curling upward like a prayer answered. But deep down, Silas knew. If the spirits were free, the living reckoning was still to come. Somewhere out there, Colonel Reed was watching. And he wasn't finished yet. The sun bled out behind the mountains, leaving the valley painted in bronze and shadow. Smoke from Aida's ceremony still drifted across the open ground, curling upward like ghosts reluctant to leave. Silas stood at the edge of the circle, rifle in hand, scanning the ridge where Reed's riders had vanished. The silence was wrong, too still, too patient. He knew men like Reed didn't back down, they regrouped. Ida knelt in the center of the circle, her hands still trembling from the ritual. The last of the firelight glowed on her face, streaked with ash and tears. She looked exhausted but calm, like someone who had given everything and still found peace in the giving. "It's done," she whispered. "They are gone." "Maybe the spirits," Silas muttered, eyes narrowing at the dark line of trees. "But not the men." Ida looked up, sensing what he already knew. "He will come." "Yeah," he said quietly. "He always does." They reached the cabin by nightfall. The air had turned bitter again, frost biting at their faces. Silas led Mercy into the small barn beside the cabin and rubbed her down while Aida carried in what little supplies they had left. Flour, salt, a handful of bullets. He felt her presence at his back before she spoke. "You think he follows us?" He nodded. "He's not a man who leaves things unfinished." Ida's eyes lingered on the horizon, where a faint orange glow flickered in the distance. "Fire," she murmured. Silas followed her gaze. It was there, low, creeping flames beyond the ridge, moving against the wind. His stomach twisted. "He's burning the trail. To smoke us out? Or trap us in?" He moved fast then, checking his rifle, counting rounds. Only 6 left in the chamber, another 5 in the belt. "If he comes here, we won't last long." Ida didn't flinch. "Then we fight." Silas turned toward her, meeting her steady gaze. "You don't have to stay for this. There's a way through the East Ravine. You could make it to the river before sunrise." She shook her head. "I finished what began. You helped me, now I help you." He wanted to argue, but the quiet certainty in her voice stopped him. She wasn't afraid. Maybe she'd already made peace with what came next. He wasn't sure he ever would. By midnight, the fire reached the tree line behind the cabin. Sparks fell from the sky like angry stars. Silas had doused the roof with water from the well, but it wouldn't hold long. The air was thick with smoke and the bitter scent of pine pitch. Then came the sound horses, at least half a dozen, maybe more. He stepped to the window, peering through the smoke. Figures emerged from the darkness, torches in hand, faces half lit by flame. And at the center, mounted tall on a black horse, was Colonel Montgomery Reed. Even after 10 years, Silas recognized him. The same cold eyes, the same sharp jaw, only now with the arrogance of a man who thought himself untouchable. "Thornton!" Reed's voice boomed through the night, deep and commanding. "I know you're in there. Don't make me turn this place to ash with you inside." Silas's jaw clenched. Too late for that. Ida stood near the hearth, clutching her medicine cord. She met Silas's eyes, calm even as the walls shook from the wind. "He wants you to come out." "Yeah, but he's not walking away with what he wants." Silas stepped to the door, rifle ready. "You stay behind me no matter what happens." She nodded once. Then he kicked the door open. The cold hit him like a fist. Outside, the night burned with firelight and snow, the ground littered with glowing embers. Reed sat astride his horse. 6 armed men fanned out around him, rifles raised. "Didn't figure I'd ever see you again, Thornton," Reed called, smiling without warmth. "Heard you'd gone soft, living up here with ghosts." "Guess you heard wrong," Silas said. Reed's gaze flicked toward the cabin. "You've got something that belongs to me." "Don't reckon I do." "I'm talking about the woman," Reed said. "The Apache witch. She's mine." Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. "She's nobody's." Reed laughed, a low, cruel sound. "You always were sentimental. That's why you were never more than a good soldier." "Me? I learned that land, people, even God. Everything's just property if you've got the will to take it." Silas's voice came cold and even. "That what you told yourself at Raven Ridge?" For the first time, Reed's smile faltered. "You think I care about some burned-out village? That was war. You and I both know what had to be done." "No," Silas said, his eyes steady. "You know what you did. I just carried the weight." Reed's expression hardened. "Last chance, Captain. Hand her over, and I might let you keep breathing." Silas raised the rifle. "You want her? Come take her." The first shot came from the left, a sharp crack that shattered the stillness. Silas dropped to one knee and fired back, hitting the man square in the chest. Another shot tore through the cabin door, splintering wood. Aida ducked behind the table, praying under her breath. The air filled with gunfire, smoke, and chaos. Horses screamed. Bullets tore through the night like angry bees. Silas fired again, then again, moving between cover, reloading as fast as he could. Reed dismounted, shouting orders. "Flank him! Burn the place down!" 2 men rushed the cabin with torches. Ida moved before Silas could stop her. She grabbed the medicine cord, dipped it into the fire, and hurled it toward the men. The flames flared with a strange hiss, and the torches died out instantly, smoke curling upward in spirals. Silas stared, stunned. "What the hell?" "Spirit fire," she said, voice trembling. "Only burns evil." Reed's men hesitated, fear flashing in their eyes. Reed snarled, grabbing a rifle from one of them. "Enough of this!" He fired. The bullet grazed Silas's shoulder, spinning him backward. He hit the ground hard, teeth gritted against the pain. Aida screamed his name. Reed advanced, gun drawn, his boots crunching through snow. "Should have stayed buried, Thornton." Silas pushed himself up, blood soaking through his sleeve. "Maybe, but I wasn't finished." He fired from the ground, the shot catching Reed's leg. The colonel stumbled, cursed, and raised his weapon again. Ida stepped forward, voice rising in a chant. Louder, faster, fierce. The wind howled through the valley, swirling snow and ash around them. The air seemed to pulse, alive with something ancient. Reed turned toward her, eyes wide. "Shut up!" he shouted, firing blindly. Silas lunged, slamming into him. The 2 men crashed into the snow, grappling for the gun. Fists, blood, and rage, all tangled in one desperate fight. "You think this changes anything?" Reed growled, driving his elbow into Silas's ribs. "You can't wash away what you did." Silas grabbed his collar, teeth bared. "No, but I can stop you from doing it again." He twisted, forcing the gun away. It went off between them, one deafening explosion that silenced the world. Reed's body went limp. His head fell back into the snow, eyes still open, reflecting the firelight like 2 dying embers. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Silas rolled away, chest heaving. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled the air. Ida ran to him, falling to her knees. "You hurt?" "Not bad," he said, though the blood on his shoulder said otherwise. He looked at Reed's body, half buried in snow. "It's over." Ida shook her head slowly. "For him, yes. For you, not yet." She looked up at the sky, where the fire's glow faded into a quiet storm of snowflakes. "The spirits have what they need. Now it is your turn." Silas followed her gaze. The burning trees beyond the ridge were dying down, the smoke thinning into gray wisps against the stars. The valley was silent again, the air almost tender. He thought of all the years he'd spent hiding from this moment, of guilt, of nightmares, of the faces he couldn't forget. And then he looked at Aita, alive and unbroken, and felt something shift inside him. Maybe this was what redemption looked like. Not grand, not loud, but quiet and heavy, like the earth after rain. He stood slowly, wincing at the pain in his arm. "We can't stay here. The fire will spread soon." Ida nodded. "Then we go east, to the river." He helped her onto Mercy's back and climbed up behind her. The horse snorted, uneasy but steady. As they rode into the dark, the first snow began to fall again, soft and slow. Behind them, the cabin collapsed in a burst of sparks, swallowed by flame. Silas didn't look back. Some homes, he figured, were meant to burn, so a man could finally start again. The river valley opened before them at dawn, quiet, silver, alive with mist. Snow lay in scattered patches along the banks, melting into the current like ghosts slipping home. Silas Thornton guided the mare down the slope carefully, one hand steady on the reins, the other pressed against his bandaged shoulder. Ida sat in front of him, wrapped in a blanket, her braid tangled from the long night ride. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. The silence between them wasn't the old, heavy kind anymore. Not the kind built from guilt or fear. It was softer now, full of something unspoken and fragile. When they reached the edge of the water, Silas dismounted and helped her down. The cold bit through his coat, but the pain in his arm had dulled to a low throb. He'd stopped bleeding hours ago. The rest, the ache that lived deeper than the wound, wasn't something a doctor could fix anyway. Ida stepped closer to the river, her moccasins sinking into the mud. "This place," she said softly, "is where the spirits cross." Silas watched her kneel and touch the surface of the water with her fingertips. Ripples spread outward, catching the rising sun. "Looks peaceful enough," he said. "It is," she murmured. "Peace is not the same as quiet. Sometimes peace comes after the storm." He nodded. "Guess we've had plenty of both." She smiled faintly, her first real smile since he'd found her in the snow. "Yes." They built a small fire by the riverbank and rested. The smoke rose thin and white, drifting toward the pines. Silas used the last of his coffee grounds, the familiar scent grounding him back in something human. Aida sat nearby, humming under her breath. That same song again, Song of the Eagle. It sounded different here, lighter somehow. The melody floated across the water, mixing with the wind and the distant rush of current. When she finished, she turned to him. "You will go back?" He stared into the fire. "Back where? Ain't much left of that cabin." "Not cabin," she said, "the town, the people." He shook his head. "They wouldn't welcome me. Not after what happened. To them, I'm either a deserter or a traitor." Ada studied him, her eyes calm and knowing. "And what do you think you are?" Silas didn't answer. The question lingered in the air between them, heavier than smoke. He tossed another stick onto the fire, watching the sparks spiral upward. "Spent 10 years trying to forget what I'd done," he said finally. "Turns out forgetting ain't the same as forgiving. And maybe forgiveness doesn't come from other folks. Maybe it's something you've got to earn." Ida nodded slowly. "You earned it when you carried me from the snow." He met her gaze. "You don't know that." "I do." Her voice was soft but certain. "You gave me back my life. I gave you back your soul." Silas chuckled under his breath. "You talk like a preacher." "No," she said, "like someone who listens." They stayed by the river for 2 days. He hunted enough for both of them. Rabbits mostly, cooked over the fire with salt and ash. At night, they slept near the flames, sharing silence and warmth. On the second night, as the stars burned sharp above the mountains, Ida spoke again. "When I was little," she said, "my father told me every soul has 2 rivers, one for what it does and one for what it dreams. When you die, they meet. If they flow together, you rest. If they don't, you wander. Silas listened quietly. And what if they don't meet? Then someone else must carry the water for you, she said, until you find your way. He looked out at the dark water shimmering under the moon. Sounds like a heavy burden. It is, she said, but sometimes the one who carries the water finds peace too. He thought about that long after she fell asleep. Thought about Elizabeth, his late wife, about the men he'd led, the village he'd failed to save, the life he'd buried under miles of silence. Maybe all along, he'd been wandering between those two rivers himself, the man he was and the man he could have been. By the third morning, the wound on his shoulder had begun to heal. Ida said the land would hold through spring, that the soldiers wouldn't come again, not after Reed was gone. She spoke of going south to live among the Navajo who had taken in some of her kin. You could come, she said quietly as they stood beside the horses, ready to leave the valley. They would accept you. Silas smiled, small and tired. I appreciate it, but I think my road runs a different way. You will go alone again? Seems that's how I started, he said. But maybe not the same man who started. Ida nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then I will leave you this. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a small object. A feather bound with leather and beads. It shimmered faintly in the morning light. For when you forget again, she said. So you remember that even a man who walks alone can still be part of the song. He took it gently, turning it over in his hands. Thank you. She smiled once more. You already thanked me, the night you saved me. Then she mounted her horse, gave a small nod, and rode toward the southern trail. Silas watched until she disappeared into the pines, her figure swallowed by mist and sunlight. He stayed by the river until noon. The world was quiet, the way it got after something terrible had finally ended. The fire had burned out, leaving only gray ash and warmth beneath the dirt. Silas looked down at the feather in his palm, feeling its softness against his calloused fingers. He tied it to his rifle strap, then turned toward the water. The river moved slow and endless, carrying fragments of ice and branches toward the plains. It didn't hurry. It didn't forget. It just kept going. He thought about Reed's words. Everything's just property if you've got the will to take it. And he thought about Aida's. Peace is not the same as quiet. One had lived for power, the other for meaning. He wondered which of those men he'd been. He crouched, scooping a handful of cold water, and let it run through his fingers. For the first time in years, he didn't see blood when he looked at his hands. Just water. Just light. When he finally saddled Mercy again, the wind had picked up. Clouds moved across the sun, scattering the light into pieces that danced across the hills. He turned east, toward whatever lay ahead. Maybe a town, maybe wilderness, maybe nothing at all. It didn't matter. For the first time since Raven Ridge, he wasn't running. He was moving forward. He took one last look at the valley. The river glistened, winding like silver thread through the mountains, carrying everything that had been lost towards someplace new. Rest easy, he murmured, all of you. Then he touched the feather on his rifle and rode away, leaving behind the fire, the smoke, and the man he used to be. As the trail stretched out beneath the wide open sky, Silas felt a strange stillness settle over him. Not emptiness, but peace. He didn't know where he was going, only that he'd keep riding until he found something worth stopping for. He thought of Aida's words again. Every soul has two rivers. Maybe his had finally met. The horizon ahead shimmered with light, the kind that made you believe a man could start over. He smiled to himself and whispered, almost like a prayer, maybe this time I'll carry the water right. Final reflection for the audience. If you had been Silas, burdened by guilt, haunted by the past, would you have dared to save the very person who reminded you of your sins? Do you believe redemption is something we earn, or something we accept when another person chooses to forgive us?